where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see.
A big, powerful America, and shoot them for what?
On that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other.
That they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary. And you're going to have to keep on saying that.
I want you to imagine a huge explosion just destroyed the building you were in. You climb through the rubble and look around, and it's early in the morning, but it looks like nighttime. The air was thick with dark smoke, and you're startled when you see a black object shuffling toward you. You soon notice that this black object is followed by other black objects. You at first mistake these objects for ghosts, but as they come closer, you realize you're looking at people with missing body parts and some even carrying their own eyeballs. Today's topic or episode will be nuclear war in the Renaissance. We'll be referencing Nuclear War by Annie Jacobsen as well as Nuclear War Survivor Skills by Cresson H Kearny, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that in any way. This intro is from Annie's book. It's an account from a girl who survived the nuclear attack in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I think it might be Hiroshima. This particular segment was hard for me because I find that this title is a bit misleading and even irrational. I really think it's fair to assume that there is no Renaissance in the case of a nuclear war, especially to the size and scale that Annie describes. I believe that this particular scenario is dark, but it seems likely. Now, I read Nuclear War and Survival Skills to brighten this up a little bit. I think it's important that we provide hope in all of these segments. And in terms of Cresson is more focused on this idea of preparation. And I think it helps in terms of the world that we live in today. Unfortunately, weak men with fragile egos, all dressed up in business suits, they may very well decide that they would prefer this idea of mass suicide to losing power. According to Annie, it would take the Earth about 24,000 years to recover from a large-scale nuclear war. I'm going to do my best to not attack how ignorant or weak our government is to not continue the work of JFK, but apparently JFK was the last president we had that actually served in the military. And I don't think it's coincidence that he was the only one to make strides towards signing an agreement to not test nuclear weapons. In terms of Annie, her scenario, she really embodies this idea that nuclear war is mass suicide. And she presents this hypothetical scenario to really highlight how this race towards nuclear war development or nuclear weapon development is essentially trying to find a way for us to kill ourselves more efficiently, if you will. I would like to advocate for this particular Renaissance to be a time period where we relabel nuclear weapons into tools for terraforming. In any case, Cresson's on the other end of the spectrum, I would say. He's more focused on this idea of preparation in case of an actual nuclear war. In this book, Cresson for Nuclear Survival, was updated and expanded in 1987, And it was, this is before I was born, but he seems to be hopeful about the results of an altercation in using nuclear weapons. I have a problem with following this particular thread, because it does feel like we're just trying to become less insane in this regard, but it is truly the world that we live in right now. But suggest that this scenario that Jane brings up is not necessarily the only outcome, and not necessarily the most likely outcome. He seems to believe that nuclear weapons and strategies are being refined in order for foreign countries to disarm rather than eradicate a populace of people. And he thinks many people can survive a nuclear war, or a nuclear exchange, I'll say. I won't say war. I think there's a fine line between a nuclear exchange that focuses on disarmament and an actual nuclear war. I think it's worthwhile really drawing the line between the two, because it does appear that, or Annie is focused on this idea of a nuclear war. I hope I didn't call her Jane throughout this. Annie's focused on this idea of nuclear war and painting the scenario in case of a nuclear war. And it does appear that Cresson's more so talking about a nuclear exchange in terms of survival. That's where the idea of survival skills comes into play. I'm going to make this particular separation throughout this, because in the scenario that Annie highlights, it is tremendously different in terms of what happens in the case to where we actually have ability, time, and space to use the survival skills that Cresson points and highlights. It is important that I bring up this idea of Cresson making me more hopeful in the idea of crisis really being a driving factor of human evolution. That is very different than what we're talking about in Annie's book. The idea of new lifestyles and coming about and springing up from crisis, it does open us up to a variety of options, and I think it's important that we think about those options beforehand. In the cases of crisis, we often don't think about the idea of who fills that particular hole that's created by a power vacuum, and in a lot of cases, it can very well be the worst kind of people, right? Dictators, people who are more militant. But in terms of actual hope, how that comes about, what we can do, if there is a nuclear exchange, there is an opportunity for a new life to come about in terms of a crisis. And it's hard to talk about the idea of what can take place after such a tragedy. But I do think it is important and worthwhile to explore and really think about what can come next. In any case, I do agree with Cresson in the idea that we don't necessarily want to sit here and wait with this umbrella that's going to protect us from everything. I'm referring to the protest where, I believe it was in China, where they held up umbrellas. This protest was a real signifier for the uselessness of where our protection really derives from, and the facade that our government decides to put up in so many cases. Throughout this segment, I'm basically just ripping myself in two. I understand it's crazy to argue whether a small nuclear exchange, us having the ability and time and space to make use of a lot of the survival skills that Cresson talks about. But in terms of actuality, this is the world we live in. We live in a world where insane people hold power, and it's better to be I'm thinking of the quote, "A warrior in a garden is better than a gardener in a war," and that's the true difference here that I really want to inspire people to be one or the other. And Cresson really believes that this idea of a nuclear war is exaggerated in a lot of cases, and in terms of the exaggeration, it's really in hope that we really try to convince our politicians to enter into certain treaties. And I frankly think that we should do both in terms of prepare and really move toward pressuring our politicians to take part in these treaties and push towards actual peace. For those that don't know, in the Apocalypse and the Renaissance segment, we talked about how one of the authors mentions this idea of celebrations around preparedness. I think a good idea would be to incorporate this idea of nuclear war preparation, but also pair that with letters and content sent directly to our politicians in terms of advocating for real peace, right? This can be a variety of things. You know, you can actually show people what you're trying to do to prepare and what it's taking you in terms of the resources it may be taking you to prepare, and sending that to your congressman or your state representative or your representative in any case. This is important, though, in terms of integrating both of these into whatever takes place, right? So if we have preparation, I do want to advocate for us really pairing that with the idea of pressuring our representatives into effective treaties. When it comes down to treaties, a lot of us, of course, would think about JFK and what JFK was trying to do. For those that don't know, JFK successfully, in a lot of particular regards, advocated and put into place a nuclear test ban treaty, right? And this nuclear test ban treaty was really prohibited nuclear weapons from being tested in the sea, underwater, in the atmosphere, or in our outer space. It also allowed underground nuclear tests as long as no radioactive debris fell outside of the boundaries of the nation conducting tests. Now, don't quote me on that. That could be just the fact of any particular test done could fall outside of the actual bounds of the country. I think that's the important note here. Not sure about the underground part. In terms of pledging signatures, these countries that signed and agreed to this treaty, they agreed to work towards complete disarmament and to end this armament race, right? And that's very important. There hasn't really been any strides since JFK. This is interesting because in terms of in this particular treaty, we have also a promise to end the contamination of the environment by radioactive substances. This treaty, it wasn't a goal. It was simply an acknowledgement of a goal. That's what's important here. That's where we move forward, and that's what I would feel is our responsibility to the next generation to continue toward this goal. Of course, in Annie's book, she goes over the scenario to paint this picture of really the insanity that would ensue in the case of an actual nuclear war. What's funny is we got trillions wrapped into this race toward suicide, and I mean, if anybody wants to point this out to someone who may be trying to save taxpayers' money, that'd be great. I think they'd be successful by getting us to sign a treaty to really continue this particular, or really continue JFK's work and promote disarmament, period, for a lot of people and in general. We could save a lot of money on weapons and prioritize creating a society that is worth venturing the stars. Maybe I'm thinking we can put an end to homelessness, come up with an arrangement for translating our weapons into tools for terraforming. The possibilities really become endless at that point when we really decide to put a stop to this particular form of absolute insanity. One thing I think a lot of us don't understand is that we don't have a meaningful defense against nuclear weapons. we got anti-missile defense, quote unquote, but this is really just a bunch of contractors in military uniforms making unfounded claims and convincing the military to give them money. And there's more countries than just Russia and China and the US that have nuclear weapons. Of course, North Korea, but also we got the UK, we have France, we have India, Pakistan, as well as Israel. Something interesting I learned in Annie's book was that Russia actually helped make North Korea more relevant in this idea of nuclear arms with providing them some critical launch technology. That says a lot that they were willing to give North Korea technology in terms of how they would view the West in general, in terms of what we do and who we are abroad. Please check out WikiLeaks and the Renaissance if you haven't and you want to know a little bit more about that. I really want to acknowledge one man heard about this particular insanity being presented, the idea of nuclear weapons and what happens in the case of a nuclear weapon exchange. David M. Shoup. I apologize if I mispronounced that. It is Shoup is S-H-O-U-P. And Mr. Shoup stood alone to call out the implications during a presentation. The presenter talked about the casualties of a nuclear exchange in other particular countries, and Mr. Shoup got up and said any particular exchange that would lead to this many casualties is simply not a valuable response that we really need to be considering as people. Mr. Shoup is a dedicated war vet, and this isn't surprising, right? Because it's always someone who's seen combat in one way, shape, or form that understands and knows that we're doing something very wrong. The Pentagon is, of course, going to be a primary target for foreign militaries in any case, but also I want to really point out the fact that we have a plethora of bases and targets around the country, and we got a lot of money tied into this race and a lot of different bases spread across the country, and those bases make it more and more likely that we'll experience the actual ramifications of a nuclear war. They'll be on our front doorstep. So the government is using our money to really spread and make sure that there are plenty of people that would experience the consequences of a nuclear exchange. At some point, Annie talks about this idea of agreements that countries have in terms of, in the case that we do resort to nuclear weapon exchange, the idea is that countries will not attack nuclear plants. And if you attack a nuclear plant, the idea is there's going to be ramifications that last well past our lifetime. And this is funny because it's likely not going to matter. We can safely assume that when we resort to a nuclear war, no formal rules are going to be followed. Also, we've got this thing where this list of succession, and the idea is that presidential power will follow this list, right? So the president, the vice president, I believe it's the Speaker of the House, down this particular list, right? So if things do go crazy, Annie points out in a nuclear war that list, it will not be important in terms of how we respond. This is very, very important because the president the person with presidential power, you would think that they would be the one person to actually pull the trigger for any type of nuclear exchange. But that likeliness of who has presidential power, or we're likely not going to see that person. What's going to happen is there's going to be a system, and there is a system in place to make sure that we retaliate and send back nuclear weapons. In Annie's particular scenario, we're attacked by North Korea, particularly a North Korean submarine. And she points out that we have a particularly weak defense in terms of detecting a submarine in general. This is something that's documented through previous quote-unquote enemy or foreign country submarines getting close to our shore, and how close that they were able to get to our shore without being detected. In this scenario, we talked about how anti-missiles haven't passed any significant tests to confidently say that they'll be of any use, and we use them anyway. I mean, we got them. We pay for them. We use them anyway, and of course they don't work. And this chaos ensues, and we retaliate. We send nuclear weapons. But what's interesting about us sending nuclear weapons in retaliation is that North Korea they're prepared for a nuclear war. They have very developed underground spaces and tunnels. In the case to where they start a nuclear war, we can safely assume that those leaders, Kim Jong-un or whoever's in charge, they're going to be in a safe position from any type of retaliation that we may bring upon or may send to North Korea, right? If that's not enough, our particular bombs would have to go over Russia to reach North Korea. And given this incredibly short amount of time that we have to respond to a new in this particular exchange, because it's chaos. There is a deadline to where you want to decide what to do in those particular situations, and us making this decision, we have to really rush it. And when it comes down to us being able to get in contact with Russia, given this particular scenario, it's not going to be likely, and we're not going to be able to explain that, hey, those weapons above your head, that bomb that you see that's being carried by this missile, it's a nuclear weapon, but it's not meant for you. I don't know if they'd believe that. I don't know if they'd just take us as, good word and really just decide to say, you know what, let's trust them. But even so, the likeliness of them even getting on the phone is small, right? So we have problems stacked on top of problems here. Given our history with Russia, Annie assumes that they go ahead and respond just like we do, in terms of the idea is that you don't give these bombs a chance to go off before you actually make a decision on what to do. A very stark kind of image that really stuck in my brain was the idea of the pilots of these particular planes that carry whatever payload that they may have. They leave the ground without an understanding or certainty or whether they'll have a home to come back to. It's very, very dark. But if things aren't dark enough, the idea of North Korea, there's a very high likelihood that they can be prepared and set to send a nuclear weapon our way as an EMP rather than just the actual explosion itself. And this particular EMP can take out pretty much the entire country. For those that don't know, an EMP is essentially just it's a weapon that goes off and it disrupts our electrical power grid. The electrical power that you get in a lot of situations, they would simply be offline, for if not for everyone, then for the vast majority of people. In case of a nuclear actual exchange where an EMP goes off, us regular people, we're most certainly not going to be in that 0.001% of people who are prepared for an EMP. But our military, they make sure that our tax dollars go toward actually making sure and beefing up whatever facilities that they need to remain operational. Annie's book was depressing, and just to be in truth, I was really there were moments to where I would simply be angry while I read portions of this book. But it did lead me to picking up Nuclear War Survival Skills by Cresson, and I think that's a light. So please bear with me. Now, in addition to Russia sending nukes, the projected fallout from these particular attacks over China would likely be interpreted as an act of war. They could easily get involved, and at some point NATO gets involved, and we have simply one nuke leading to hundreds, if not thousands, of nukes going off. And Annie goes into various details. Please, if you're, I highly recommend the book, even though it is depressing. But I think it is important for us to understand what's being said here. I think a lot of the American people would really come to an understanding that this is not feasible for us. And I found this particular quote, or she provided this particular quote, and this is by Einstein, who I think said it best. He said, "I don't know how we will fight World War III, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Dark, depressing, I know, but Cresson does provide a light in terms of preparation that we can do, in case he is right about the actual case that would take place. Of course, I said this before, I would advocate for preparation alongside with pressuring our Congress towards a meaningful treaty. And Cresson really points out how this idea of how we understand nuclear weapons or nuclear bombs, in the case of a nuclear bomb, it's more so painted by quote-unquote social justice warriors, right, who've really gotten into science in a way. And I think there is truth to that, and I'm still going to agree with the idea and the stark understanding, because we're really depending on us being a little less insane in the case of a nuclear exchange. I feel like a lot of us, in terms of with this social justice thing, we talk about fighting for the earth, and one thing we really need to understand is that the earth is going to really be just fine. The real question is whether we as humans will be around to enjoy as a species. I think we really should prepare in step with advocating for meaningful treaties. And the more we prepare, the more vicious we should be in seeking out meaningful treaties. I'd like to see, if you will, a war against nuclear war take place in society. One thing that's clear in both books, though, is that Russia and Korea are way more prepared than we are. And I have a bit of I'll say, more of my conspiracy mind is really coming up here. When it comes down to America's military-industrial complex, it seems like they're incentivized to keep us in this state of hopelessness, right? Where we're really not pursuing treaties or preparing for the worst. And I imagine that it would be really a problem if we demanded that our tax dollars be spent on preparation and strengthening of our infrastructure rather than to be given to military contractors. But Cresson also mentions that there's an argument that's made against preparation, and that Preparation can be interpreted as an act of war in itself. And this is something I've seen before in terms of countries not developing defenses, that argument being made that it is an act of aggression in a way, and it can be interpreted as an act of aggression. And it's an argument, and I would say it's a very weak argument, honestly. If we pair this preparation, even as a country, in step with promotion of treaties and aggressive promotion of treaties, I think we'll have more of an understanding that, hey, this is more of a societal transformation, or foreign countries will understand that this is more of a societal transformation rather than a country simply beefing itself up in preparation for an act of actual aggression. Now, as I mentioned before, in terms of Cresson, he advocates that foreign countries would really refine the strategies in their weapons towards disarmament, and this could lead to smaller nuclear weapons. Take it as you will. I would say preparation in step with aggression, with more aggressive behavior to pursue an actual treaty in any way, shape, or form. Now, I was really struck by how Cresson mentions Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he talks about how there were shelters that stood up right outside of 100 yards from the actual blast site itself. Shelters that are built to resist fallout will be well beyond the requirements to really resist or really stand up to any particular blast outside of that kind of relatively small radius of the actual blast site itself, right? In terms of people that really need to worry about blast sites would be people who live near military bases or inside large cities in general. Another thing is that nuclear fallout degrades tremendously around 48 hours after the actual explosion itself. Think about that fall, the chart falls off significantly. I'm thinking about an S-curve chart. We're looking at the fall off point of an S-curve chart. A lot of that fall off takes place within the 48 hours, and there's still a lot in the air being compared to times of peace, rather than actual wartime or a time of right after a nuclear exchange of any kind. But fallout is interesting in terms of how it is. I mean, if we're thinking about something that's going to drive a lot, or that drives a lot of people mad, is thinking about fallout, or experiencing fallout, right? And it's interesting because we have to think about a lot in terms of or a few things in terms of a nuclear exchange or a nuclear bomb, right? One being hot fallout and fires, right? Something that we may not have an understanding of, but after an actual nuclear weapon goes off, a lot of buildings are likely to set fire as a result from projectiles that come from that particular explosion. The flammable materials that are in everyday houses and appliances or things of that nature, those are going to be really number one in terms of fallout, I would say, right? The damages that can come from a fallout. Beta radiation would be number two, right? So for those that don't know, we got these two different radiations, beta and gamma, but beta radiation, that's apparently where a lot of the harm would come from, right? In terms of when we think about the harmfulness of an actual exposure to radiation after a nuclear exchange. And like I said before, the actual concentration in the air would degrade tremendously after 48 hours, right? This would mean that the fallout has settled, right? People being poisoned from what is in the actual air itself. But the ground is still going to have a lot of particles that would be harmful to people in general. The air is still going to have a lot. There's still going to have harmful harmful concentrations of radiation, and we will need masks, and we will need to really, really act accordingly in terms of the normal things that a lot of us are thinking about in terms of protecting our, creating masks that protect us in certain ways, and wearing masks and wearing equipment that is appropriate when you're experiencing radiation of any kind. But Cresson really wants to point out how it's painted, right? How that particular aftermath is painted. It's not going to be as likely for people who are really more prepared with adequate shelter and working fallout meters. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But Cresson believes that we can survive and avoid a lot of radiation from really just that basic preparation in general. This Cresson talks about a lot about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he goes back to that point a lot, which is interesting because I haven't heard that particular understanding. Haven't heard nuclear wars really depicted in more of an analysis of what's happened in those particular areas. And that's, like I said, it's hopeful in a way to see that. This is really a source for a lot of what he comes up with, and what really, I think, led to him making this book and creating and writing this book. We'll talk about particularly shelters in a second, and shelters and meters, of course. But when it comes down to water filtration, of course, we have the water treatment capsules that are for all the people who are preppers out there, they understand, right? But when it comes down to filtrating water, when you don't have those options, when you don't have a lot of more favorable options available, it's going to be this contaminated water, and what you can do to decontaminate it, that's really going to be more valuable to you. This is interesting because a lot of us may think of a filter being activated charcoal and mixtures of rocks and things of that nature. But Cresson points out how the best filter will be just the general earth itself. If we don't have access, let's say, to an actual filter to pour this water down, to filter out a lot of whatever, we can take dirt or earth or clay, mix it in the water, and wait until it settles. And that right there, that's going to be more effective drinking non-treated water. And beta radiation is going to be the primary, right? So that's what happens in terms of the bulk of what we'd expect to happen in terms of a nuclear fallout. What we really stress about, a lot of us, in a nuclear fallout. And this idea of gamma radiation would be more long-lasting radiation, and it's not as harmful as we would probably think. After we give whatever fallout, this 48-hour period, hopefully longer. I've heard up to a week in some particular fictions and books like that, and I think the longer we give it, the better. But I think it's also practical that we have to really acquire resources to survive at some point. But when it comes down to this idea of us going outside, we do want to cover up. We do want to kind of make sure that our air is filtered in whatever best case scenario that we have. But it's going to really help to have that fallout meter, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So I don't want to minimize any of that. But I will say that the increase in cancer rate among survivors was not nearly as significant as I think a lot of us would deem as such. The idea of a nuclear winter being unsurvivable, Cresson would say, is ultimately a myth, right? And he even calls out people like Carl Sagan, right? And that's very interesting in terms of what we really come to understand about nuclear exchanges in general. This map, this is really to point out the idea of fallout is likely to move with the wind. So it's likely going to move east. Okay? Do with that information what you will, but when it comes down to understanding the idea of who should be worried about fallout, when you should be worried about fallout, I think this map in general is going to help a lot of people in terms of what making some pretty significant decision. Now, fallout shelters can be built fairly easy, right? Apparently, this idea of ground shelters that don't have the bells and whistles that may come with a shelter that's in a basement or connected to the actual house itself. It can be more protective. It can, in terms of actual shelters in the ground versus what happens and the fallout penetration that could take place in basement shelters. I think a lot of us need to understand that and really think about what can take place in general and really what we want to do in preparation. Now, I'm going to try not to turn this into a construction design course, but I'll link some documents and really help you guys understand a lot of the construction of shelters and what can be done for people who are really trying to construct something more serious themselves or depend on their building professionals to construct their own shelters. There are some things that I want to highlight though. If you're, let's say you're in a pickle, right? And you have the ability to dig a hole that's big enough for you in any way, shape, or form. Fallout protection is going to depend on 3 feet of earth between you and the air in general. Keep that understanding and try to form and shape your particular situation in those particular circumstances, right? And of course, this is for the people who have the opportunity to dig holes, right? And have the space and time to dig holes. In terms of next, the idea of ventilation is something that Cresson really hammers on, and this is interesting because our government FEMA shelters, they may not be prepared if the electricity goes out. And Cresson, he built this device up, right? It is called the KAP. He built this device up, and I'm kind of laughing because it was really just a more efficient way to fan air in a certain direction, and that was, I'm sure it's great. I'm sure it's excellent. If you can really imagine how to fan air in a certain direction and what's required to fan air in a certain direction, you can probably do something. And it's important because ventilation is something that could easily lead to uncomfortable situations that could result in someone actually leaving the shelter and possibly being exposed to fallout if this isn't something that is well understood and planned for. The next thing I really want to bring up is this idea of separating fecal matter and actual pee, right? And I feel like there's a better way for me to say that, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it. When it comes down to this idea of separating these two in a certain situation, if you're in a shelter, you're going to be able to use likely the same bucket regardless, but I highly recommend that you poop inside of a bag or something that you can close, right? And the idea here is that, like, if you can urinate directly into a bucket and throw it out with no real impact on the surrounding environment, but when it comes down to poop, you may discover that flies would be attracted to that, and that becomes more likely in the case of a nuclear fallout, because if there is a nuclear weapon, we can assume that carcasses will be around and flies will be able to proliferate on those carcasses. And let's say you have exposed poop in an area around your shelter or in your shelter, those flies put their feet into the fecal matter and can spread disease when they find a way into a shelter. And that is something that I think a lot of people don't quite think about as much, but it's very important. This idea of being in that shelter, what you do, closing that, when you do decide to use the bathroom, how you do that, how you get rid of it, it becomes more important. This idea of really getting rid of things, I think a lot of people should understand that they can prepare for going outside as if they would normally do, even providing shoe covers. But that short amount, we'll talk about it a little bit later with the fallout meters, but that short amount of time span that you spend outside may not be nearly as significant as you think, right? Unless we're in that 48-hour period. If we're in that 48-hour period, stay inside. Please stay inside. Don't go out. I think that's well understood, even for some sources, even extending beyond that 48-hour period. But if you're in a situation where you need resources, you need to find resources, you need to go out for any reason, I think it's reasonable to really state that 48-hour period as that definite, that definite point to where you can leave the shelter in some degree of safety, and have some degree of safetiness. Another thing is that this idea of dirt floors and walls, and the idea here is that if you do have dirt floor and walls, you need to understand that you can and very likely will develop moisture. Having different types of covering is something that would be invaluable in terms of that comfort that you have, for that stay that you have to be in there for. And this is interesting because, the layers, I think, should really, really come after plastic, right? So if you're going to put anything down, definitely put any cloth down, put plastic under the cloth if you can layer it, if you have that opportunity. Also, just that understanding of the idea that you don't want to be exposed to just the dirt and the earth, and it's not, you should understand that it may not always be dry, comfortable in a lot of situations, and plan accordingly. When it comes down to being in a space, please also understand that you don't want to necessarily use chemicals, right? So this can be bug spray, this can be a lot of different things. Understand that you may be stuck with this air for a long period of time past what you may be thinking when you do use these chemicals. When it comes down to the best furniture for really saving space in general, hammocks, and I'll link some particular cases for how to build hammocks, how to make hammocks in general, but that is top tier, your best scenario. I'll also add some attachments that Cresson had in his book for constructed shelters and plans for constructed shelters. Like I said, it's I feel like I'm gonna make a fallout shelter, some kind of video to walk through this whole thing in terms of people who want to formally construct a shelter. But please have that understanding that this is, building a shelter and having that maintained. You want to have an understanding along with that shelter, right? You don't want just the normal particular construction contractor to come in, give you a shelter. You want to carry an understanding of that purpose, what you're going to do in these particular scenarios and cases. So whether that is a construction general or contractor that is also talking to a consultant, you may need to have more than just that constructed shelter. It could be, I'm thinking about pamphlets in certain places that let you know what to do with what particular materials and stuff like that. When it comes down to preparation, it's going to require more than likely just your normal everyday contractor consultant. In any and every case, the idea of what happens with water should be in your mind. If you're stuck in any scenario case, right, so the contractors, I think they'll think about this, and they should think about this, but if you're in a situation, understand the concept of shedding water, how water sheds, how water builds up, where water can build up, and what to do with that particular scenario if you need to do something in those particular scenarios. Clothing is something that is really at times more important than the shelter itself, right? So if you have the certain basic needs of a shelter, clothing is something that really can help you in a lot of cases. In terms of keeping warm in particular, the idea is to create stagnant air around the skin. And Cresson really points out the idea that we actually seep out body heat from our particular blood vessels in our necks as well. So understand and carry that understanding of what you can do in those situations, and this idea of creating or modifying or beefing up your clothing. You can use newspapers in a lot of cases to layer cloths, and that would help tremendously, right? That concept of creating stagnant air, don't underestimate the power of newspapers, and in general, just keep newspapers around, right? So even if you need to, say for instance, use newspapers as a toilet paper substitute, I think it's really, really nice to have around in general. And even if that's not enough, the idea of you can use toilet paper to beef up things like sandals, right? So you can wrap your particular, your foot in some type of news or in enough newspapers to where it would actually be much warmer, and stick them in sandals to where they'll be warmer than if you had whether regular shoes or whatever type of footwear that you're wearing. And also this idea of Cresson has a design for a homemade mask, and I just want to say I'm a little too into fashion to even recommend something so atrocious. So I'll say you'll have to either die or figure it out. When it comes down to nutrition, one dark image that Cresson really burnt into my mind was when he shared a story about seeing a starving mother panic while she was trying to adjust her breast to feed her baby. And that right there is, I don't have a kid myself, but I feel like I'll just stock up on baby formula just in case. It was dark. It was very dark to hear him say that. Baby formula, in any case, dry baby formula where you just need to kind of add the water and let it go. That makes it to the top of the list, I think, for a lot of us. And Cresson talked about purchasing like 100 pounds of dry milk or something like that. It definitely had an impact on him, but that's number one, I think, to mention. When it comes down to beans are also great to keep. whole grains are apparently something that should be thought about in terms of creating devices that crush grain and that can crush grain. This is something that could be widely available, right? So whole grains is something that can be provided that are going to be provided for by a lot of different farms. The idea is that while they are available, they may not. The mills that crush these grains and create flour may not necessarily be operational, and having to eat uncrushed grain can result in, diarrhea, and that obviously wouldn't be good. Also, it's not this idea of salt is also important. How we get salt intake and getting regular salt intake. In terms of the operation of our particular muscles, like I said, most of us are privileged enough to not think about certain things, right? And that is one of the big ones, right? Because when it comes down to a lot of the water that we prepare and that Cresson brings up, it is paired with the idea of salt, in providing salt and an adequate amount of salt. We're not going to have, in particular situations, we will be limited. We can assume that we'll be very limited in terms of our salt intake. So actually being more conscious about that is something that we may need to worry about. In terms of water, 30 gallons of water is recommended per person, right? It's in terms of preparation, right? 30 gallons stored away is great. Please don't use those regular milk jugs, or the plastic that comes in those milk jugs, because they can leak and stuff like that. But if you use kind of that hard plastic or glass, those things are better, right? Think about long term in terms of storage. And one thing that I just never really thought about was the idea of vitamin C. And Cresson mentions a few things, but vitamin C, in terms of besides this list, but I think vitamin C is important to mention here because it's one of the first diseases to really worry about in terms of actually long-term stays in shelters. And the idea is that we can get something called scurvy, and you can look that up. It's not a pretty thing to experience by all means, but the idea is that this is something that's going to become more apparent for people who have to stay in shelters for extended periods of time. With fallout meters, it's keeping searching for fallout meters and finding what I found. I had to fight to keep hope alive with this one because there are websites that are selling meters, and with these particular meters, they will measure less than 1,000 millirads, and that is interesting because these devices are expensive. They sound very professional. The numbers, they sound excellent, but according to Cresson, they're essentially going to be useless in the event of a nuclear crisis. I'm going to attach a homemade meter, instructions, and a kit. Seeing what these guys are putting out there is very dark, and it's only going to help the company selling that to the people, honestly. In terms of if there is some kind of nuclear weapons exchange where you have to worry about fallout. These meters that are being sold for less, will measure less than 1,000 millirads. When it comes down to this record, 150 rads will apparently kill half the people, right? If 100 people are exposed to 150 rads, they'll kill 75 people. Now, if you're in an area where you get 150 rads per hour, it will take you an hour to consume 150 rads. Millirads. That is 1/1000th of a rad. So this is essentially, these are meters that essentially provide background fallout, right? So we're not talking about significant amounts in the case of trying to survive after a nuclear warhead drops on drops near you in any way, or you have to worry about fallout from a nuclear bomb. This is, I mean, like I said, it's this is going to, in the case if there is ever a nuclear bomb, this is going to only be helpful to the people in the companies who sold it, and they were able to build their own. It's just disgusting to think that this is, to think how this is packaged, because a lot of people, I'm sure, would think that these are meters that would help them in those cases. And this idea of Ki, right? So Ki is potassium iodide. And when it comes down to radiation, our thyroids are the first and most common victim, right? When it comes down to iodide flows to the thyroid first. Iodide in the actual nuclear exchange, or after, in the fallout, that's radioactive. So the idea of potassium iodide is taking potassium iodide saturates your thyroid gland with good iodide, right? So the bad iodide that could be consumed is excreted, and that's the idea here. This is something to have handy if you ever if you have the actual opportunity to keep it handy. I think it's important to keep it handy, but also the idea of these particular pills, they can also be prescribed if you talk with your doctor about problems with your particular thyroid. Some random things to bring up is really the idea of lights. First, we want to watch out for sources. We talked about how chemicals can build up and we have to share those particular spaces, or we might have to sit in those spaces for a while, but also the idea of carbon monoxide can build up as well. We have to watch out for that and make sure that our light sources aren't just kind of pumping our air to fill it, just basically just filling us with poison. One of the common symptoms of particular carbon monoxide poison is having a headache. And if you have a headache, I'm not sure if this, I want to say this is carbon monoxide poison, don't take my word, but poison of any kind that starts with a headache, and you should understand that headache is kind of a warning sign for, maybe the air isn't okay, especially if you're in stagnant air for a while. Also, if you're keeping matches and if you're going to use matches, try to make sure that those are being kept in a mason jar, and the idea is that shelter that you're in can build up moisture and ruin matches. Also, try and keep a transistor radio with extra batteries. When you are and this next thing I think is important, because a lot of people don't quite understand the conditions after a nuclear war or after a nuclear exchange of any kind, but you can assume that the roads will not be of favorable conditions in a lot of cases. Having a spare tire could save you tremendously. Try to keep a spare tire. Also, try to keep a fair amount of gas. Try not to just ride on E for too long if you can, and make sure that you have something in the tank at all times. A good note is don't drink alcohol or smoke in cold weather. These are common go-tos for a lot of people, kind of on the back porch, in terms of people who need to keep warm, but they will just feel good for the moment. When it comes down to smoking, the way it constricts blood vessels in a lot of cases, when it comes down to the dehydration that comes from drinking, these are things that will be good in the moment, but will not last for nearly a significant amount of time. So keep that in mind, and I feel like try. I don't know how hard it is going to be to keep everyone sober, but if you can try, that'd be excellent. If you have to keep in a shelter with people for a long period of time, and if you yourself drink or smoke, just try to hold it and hold out for as long as you, or for until you get out the shelter. And like I said, those chemical or that buildup from lack of ventilation in a shelter is real. Do not smoke in a shelter. Don't allow people to smoke in the shelter. That is air that you may have to deal with for a very long time. In any case, I want to say good luck if they're in any particular situations or scenarios. I want you guys to really, really take this stuff to heart. I'm going to leave some attachments here. Hopefully that will help build your understanding. And it's unfortunate, but this idea of really where we're at now, I don't think this is going to be the last story in terms of preparation. Like I said before, I might do something on nuclear fallout shelters in terms of actually constructing nuclear fallout shelters. Comment if you're interested in that in any way. But we live in a time where people profit off of war, and this is an unfortunate reality that a lot of us have to face, because the people who have the most power in society benefit off of this idea of war and fear. And please, like I said, try to pair any preparation with hassling your particular representatives about particular treaties for us to really promote the idea of peace in step with preparation. And with that being said, please do all the YouTube stuff. Do all, if you're on podcasts, subscribe or follow. And like I said, I hope for the best, and thank you for listening.